The first mistake was the music. It wasn't just loud, it was deafening, pulsing through the walls of the Brooklyn loft, like the heartbeat of a city that refused to sleep. The second mistake was the tequila, too sharp, too reckless, burning away the last fragile threads of caution Sophia De Luna had tried to wrap around herself all week. But the third mistake, that one was fatal. It was the dare. And dares, Sophia thought grimly, had a way of unspooling lives. She hadn't even wanted to come to the party. She had sworn to her roommates no. She had begged that she was too tired, too heartbroken, too raw, to pretend that life was still worth celebrating. 2 days earlier, she had walked into her own apartment and found Devon, her boyfriend of 3 years, cupping another woman's face like it was the most natural thing in the world. He hadn't even looked ashamed. He had just muttered the words that had torn her in half. I thought we were on a break. A break. That word had echoed through her chest like a gunshot. So, no, she hadn't wanted to come. But her best friend Jasmine had insisted, yanking open Sophia's closet and thrusting a too-short black dress into her hands. You're 23, girl. You don't get to cry over some two-bit fool from Queens while the rest of New York is still spinning. Tonight you're going to forget him. Tonight you're going to live. Living apparently meant being dragged to the loft party, being shoved toward a table lined with cheap liquor, and being dared into one of the most reckless stunts of her life. 1 hour, Jasmine slurred, pressing her manicured finger into Sophia's shoulder. 1 hour, in a stranger's bed. No chickening out. Just crawl in, stay until sunrise, and then you can say you did something insane for once in your life. Sophia had laughed, brittle and hollow. That's ridiculous. Exactly. Jasmine grinned. That's why you have to do it. And for the first time in years, Sophia didn't resist. She was tired of resisting, tired of holding her life together with shaky hands. Maybe this was what it felt like to finally let go. That was how, at nearly 2 a.m, Sophia De Luna found herself in the gold-lit lobby of the Waldorf Astoria on Park Avenue, her heart pounding with a mix of alcohol, adrenaline, and disbelief. The elevator doors gleamed like mirrors. Her reflection looked like someone she didn't recognize, a young woman in a short black dress, her curls tumbling loose around her shoulders, her dark skin glowing under the chandelier light, her eyes wild, with something between despair and freedom. The elevator chimed. Sophia stepped inside and, with a shaky laugh, pressed the button for the top floor. The hallway was a cathedral of silence when the doors slid open. Red velvet carpet stretched endlessly, interrupted by golden sconces that cast long dramatic shadows across the walls. Every door looked identical, polished wood brass numbers, but at the end of the hall one door sat slightly ajar, as if waiting. Sophia's breath caught. This is insane. She hesitated only for a moment, then slipped inside. The suite was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the sprawl of Manhattan at night, a city of glass and fire, every light a promise, every shadow a secret. Leather couches gleamed beneath soft lamplight, and a silver bucket cradled champagne on ice. Everything whispered wealth power, a world she had never touched. Her cheeks burned, but the dare was clear. Get into bed, stay 1 hour, leave before sunrise. The bedroom was darker than she expected. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows, painting silver across the sheets. The bed was enormous, the kind that seemed to invite and intimidate at once. Sophia's throat tightened. She slipped out of the little black dress, folding it carefully over a chair, and crawled beneath the cool, expensive sheets. The mattress embraced her soft and indulgent nothing, like the lumpy futon in her shared apartment. 1 hour, she whispered. Her laugh trembled. Just one stupid hour. She never heard the front door open. Timothy Carter had never expected company. The billionaire founder of Carter Systems had returned from a midnight meeting in San Francisco only hours ago. The private jet had landed at Teterboro. The chauffeured car had glided through the city streets, and now he wanted nothing more than silence. His penthouse at the Waldorf Astoria was supposed to be a sanctuary, a fortress against the noise of Wall Street and the vultures of the press. But when he stepped into the bedroom and saw her, saw the dark-skinned girl curled like a secret in his bed, bare shoulders gleaming under the pale moonlight, he froze. For a long moment, Timothy didn't move. Most men would have shouted, called security, demanded answers. But Timothy Carter was not most men. Instead, he loosened his tie, exhaled slowly, and crossed the room. Without a word, he slipped beneath the sheets on the other side of the bed. He did not touch her. He did not even turn toward her. He simply lay there, eyes fixed on the ceiling, every muscle tight with a strange awareness. For the first time in years, he felt alive. Sophia drifted on the edge of dreams, unaware of the man who lay inches away. In her sleep, she whispered something unintelligible, fragile. Timothy closed his eyes. It had been 5 years since he had let anyone this close. 5 years since the night in Boston when his fiancée had died in a hit-and-run on her way to meet him. He had blamed himself, buried his grief beneath deals and acquisitions, and locked his heart in silence. But this stranger, this reckless, foolish girl, had broken into his solitude without even knowing it. And somehow, instead of anger, all he felt was curiosity. The hour passed unnoticed. When Sophia stirred awake, she thought she was back in her cramped apartment in Brooklyn. But the scent was wrong, not detergent and dust, but cedar leather, faint whiskey, unmistakably masculine. She turned and froze. There was a man beside her. He was shirtless, his shoulders broad, his hair dark and tousled, his jawline sharp enough to cut. He was watching her now, his gray eyes cool, unreadable. Sophia's breath caught. Her first instinct was to scream, but her voice lodged in her throat. She clutched the sheet to her chest, her pulse thundering. The man spoke, his voice low, smooth, like velvet dragged across steel. "You're not my usual wake-up call." Sophia's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He stretched lazily, unhurried, every movement drenched in confidence. "Don't scream," he murmured. "I hate noise before coffee." Her hands shook. I thought this room was empty. I didn't know." He studied her carefully. Not the way other men might, not lingering on her body, but searching her face, her eyes, her trembling voice. "Who dared you?" he asked finally. Her cheeks flamed. It was just a stupid game. Clearly. He rose, slipping into a sleek black robe that looked more dangerous than modest. "You broke into my penthouse. You stripped in my bed, and you're still here. You're lucky I'm not calling security." Sophia scrambled for her dress, fumbling to pull it over her head. "I'm sorry. I'll leave right now." "Not yet." Her hands stilled. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Sophia." "I'm Timothy," he said simply. Of course she knew. Everyone knew. Timothy Carter, the ruthless white billionaire whose name dominated headlines, whose empire in tech and finance had reshaped industries. The man no one dared cross, the man who had never been seen with a woman in years. And now he was looking at her like she was a puzzle worth solving. As she reached the door, he spoke again. "Come back tomorrow, 10 a.m. Sophia turned, startled. "What? Why? Because I want to know." He said, his voice quieter now, almost dangerous in its calm. Why a girl who clearly doesn't belong in a place like this ended up here. Her throat tightened. "I didn't mean to, I know." His gaze didn't waver. But you did. For reasons she couldn't explain. Sophia nodded. She didn't sleep that night. Not because she was afraid, though. Fear curled inside her like a coiled animal. But because of something else. The look in Timothy's eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't lust. It was curiosity. Dangerous, hungry curiosity. And that Sophia realized, as the dawn broke over Brooklyn, was far more terrifying than either. Sophia almost didn't go. She sat on the edge of her narrow mattress in Brooklyn, staring at the cheap clock on her nightstand, as the red digits crawled closer to 9:30 a.m. Her roommates were still asleep, the muffled snores filtering through the thin walls. But the city outside was already alive. Sirens wailing, buses, groaning horns slicing through the morning air. Her chest felt tight. Every part of her body screamed to stay put. To let the memory of last night dissolve like smoke, to pretend none of it had happened. After all, what sane person would willingly walk back into the life of Timothy Carter, the man whose signature could shift markets, whose name carried weight in every boardroom across America? But sanity had never been her companion in the past 24 hours. Against her better judgment, she pulled on the cleanest clothes she had left, a plain white t-shirt, her favorite pair of jeans and sneakers, whose soles were nearly worn through. She braided her curls to keep her hands from shaking and grabbed the Metro card tucked into her wallet. The subway ride to Lexington Avenue felt endless. Every jolt of the train made her doubt every stop gave her a chance to escape. She could step off, vanish into the crowd, and no one would ever know. But each time the doors slid open, she stayed. Something about his voice from the night before clung to her, soft but insistent. Come back tomorrow. By the time she stepped into the marble atrium of Carter Tower, her stomach was a knot of nerves. The building was a temple of steel and glass, rising above Midtown Manhattan like a declaration of power. Inside the lobby gleamed with polished marble and hushed silence. Men and women in tailored suits moved with ruthless efficiency, their phones pressed to their ears, their gazes sharp. Sophia felt like an ink blot spilled across a pristine canvas. The receptionist glanced at her outfit with a flicker of surprise but said nothing. Instead, she picked up the phone, murmured a few words, and then nodded toward the private elevator at the far end. Mr. Carter is expecting you. Sophia's knees nearly buckled at those words. She followed the direction with trembling steps, each one echoing too loudly in the cavernous space. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a sleek interior, lined with brushed steel. When the doors closed, she caught her reflection in the mirrored panel, wide eyes, clenched jaw, a girl trying to look braver than she felt. The elevator shot upward, smooth and soundless. Her pulse raced with it. When the doors opened, she stepped directly into his office. It wasn't an office so much as a museum. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the far wall, offering a sweeping view of Manhattan's skyline, the skyscrapers piercing the pale morning sky. A massive desk of black glass sat like an altar at the center, and behind it, Timothy Carter stood with his hands in his pockets. He didn't turn immediately. "You came," he said at last, his voice low, deliberate. Sophia swallowed hard. "I don't know why." "Because something about last night shook you," he replied finally, pivoting to face her. His eyes, gray, sharp, unyielding, meet hers. "The same way it shook me." Her throat tightened. She wanted to laugh, to deny it, but the truth weighed too heavy in her chest. "I should leave." "But you didn't." He gestured toward a leather chair opposite the desk. "Sit." Sophia hesitated. The chair looked too pristine for someone like her. But refusing him felt impossible. She lowered herself slowly, folding her hands tightly in her lap. Timothy circled the desk and leaned against it, his gaze fixed on her. I'm not here to interrogate you, but I want to understand. Understand what she asked, her voice smaller than she wanted. Why a girl who clearly doesn't drink, doesn't party, doesn't belong in a place like the Waldorf, decided to crawl into a stranger's bed. Sophia's cheeks flamed. It was a dare. My friend's birthday. They thought it would be funny. I didn't know anyone lived there. I didn't mean to. You didn't invade, Timothy cut in. You exposed. Her brows knitted. What does that mean? He straightened slowly, crossing his arms over his chest. That room has been untouched for 5 years. No one has laid in that bed since the night my fiancé died. The words hung in the air like smoke. Sophia's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. The tabloids had whispered about a tragedy in his past, but no one knew details. No one dared ask. And here he was, offering it to her like a confession. I'm sorry, she whispered. It doesn't matter, he said, though his eyes flickered with something raw. What matters is that you, of all people, walked into that room and lay down like you belonged. I didn't belong, she said quickly. He tilted his head. Then why didn't I throw you out? She looked away. I don't know. Yes, you do. Silence stretched between them, thick and tense. Sophia twisted her fingers together, desperate for an escape, but something about his gaze pinned her in place. You've never done anything like that before, Timothy said quietly. It wasn't a question. She shook her head. I don't drink. I don't party. I don't even jaywalk. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. And yet you ended up naked in my bed. Her face flamed. You don't have to keep saying that. But it's true, he replied evenly. And the truth matters. Sophia's voice faltered. Why are you doing this? Why me? For the first time, his composure cracked just slightly. His eyes softened, though his jaw remained hard. Because when I looked at you curled up in that bed, you didn't look like an intruder. You looked like someone who needed to be there, more than I needed you gone. Her chest ached. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Timothy stepped closer, slow and deliberate, every movement calculated. He didn't touch her, didn't even reach for her. But the air shifted as if his presence alone had weight. You said you didn't know why you came back this morning, he murmured. But you do. Because for once in your life, you weren't invisible. Sophia's heart lurched. You don't know anything about me, she whispered. Then tell me, he said simply. Her lips parted, but the words caught in her throat. No one had ever asked her that before. Not Devon, not her professors, not even her mother, who worked double shifts back in Atlanta just to keep food on the table. She had always been background noise, the quiet girl in the corner sketching designs in a battered notebook. But Timothy Carter, the man who could buy and sell empires, was asking. And worse, he was listening. Sophia closed her eyes, steadying herself. Most of the time she said softly, I am invisible. But lying in that bed, I felt like I mattered, even if it was just for an hour. Timothy's gaze sharpened. The words struck something deep, something he had buried beneath years of silence. You matter, he said, the phrase landing heavier than it should have. Sophia blinked at him, caught between disbelief and something far more dangerous. The room seemed smaller now, the city beyond the windows irrelevant. For the first time since her world had crumbled 2 nights ago, she wasn't thinking about Devon or heartbreak or survival. She was thinking about this man, this impossible, untouchable man, who looked at her as if she had shifted the axis of his world. Timothy straightened, pulling the mask of composure back over his face. You don't know who I am, do you? I know your name, she admitted, but I don't know your story. that he said is the first honest thing anyone has said to me in years. And in that moment, Sophia realized something terrifying. This wasn't a dare anymore. It was the beginning of something neither of them could define, and both of them might regret. She told herself a dozen reasons not to. There was class, there was freelance work, there were bills waiting in a stack on the chipped wooden desk by her bed. There was her mother's voice in her head, reminding her that rent didn't pay itself, and dreams didn't feed you. There was also fear curling inside her chest, like a small, restless bird. And yet, at 9:50 a.m., she was standing in the lobby of Carter Tower, again, hands tucked into the pockets of her jean jacket, heart hammering against her ribs. The receptionist no longer looked surprised. Instead, she gave a professional nod, as though Sophia belonged. That was what unnerved her most, because she didn't. Not here. Not in this temple of glass and ambition. Not in this man's orbit. But when the elevator doors slid open and she stepped into Timothy Carter's office, she forgot every argument she had rehearsed. He was already waiting. Not behind his desk this time, but by the window, the skyline sprawling behind him like a painting. His suit jacket was off his sleeves, rolled a watch gleaming at his wrist. He turned slowly as she entered, and though his expression was impassive, his eyes betrayed something else. Relief. "You came back," he said. She exhaled, trying for steadiness. Apparently. It became a rhythm after that. Every morning Sophia returned. Not because he asked, though he did in his quiet, unquestionable way, but because something in her refused not to. Their encounters were not interviews, not interrogations, not even conversations in the ordinary sense. They were collisions. Two lives brushing against each other, testing boundaries, revealing cracks. Some mornings began in silence. She would sit on the leather chair, with a cup of coffee too strong for her taste, sketching in her worn notebook while he worked at his desk. The sound of his pen against paper, the occasional clipped murmur of his voice on the phone, the quiet rustle of her pencil against the page, it was strangely companionable. Other mornings unraveled into questions. He would close his laptop, lean back in his chair, and look at her with that piercing gaze that made her feel transparent. "What scares you?" he asked once. She hesitated, then said, "Failure." "What haunts you?" she countered. He didn't look away. Silence. Sometimes the questions were smaller, almost ordinary. "What was your first kiss like?" "Awkward. Forgettable." "Have you ever been in love?" she asked. He paused for a long time before answering. Once, and then never again. Each admission felt like a thread weaving something invisible between them. Neither touched it, neither defined it, but it grew all the same, taut and undeniable. Sophia found herself watching him in ways she hadn't expected. The way his jaw tightened when he read certain emails. The way his shoulders stiffened at the sound of sudden car horns below the tower. The faint tremor in his hand when he poured his coffee, quickly hidden by a steady grip. These details unsettled her, not because they made him weaker, but because they made him human. And Timothy, for his part, began noticing her too closely. He noticed how her lips pressed together when she tried not to laugh, how she tucked a curl behind her ear when nervous, how she scribbled designs in the margins of her notebook as though her mind never stopped creating. One morning, he ended a call early, just to watch her sleep on the office couch, curled like a secret she hadn't meant to share. It frightened him, that pull. He had built his life on precision, on walls, on never allowing anyone close enough to matter. And yet this girl, this quiet, stubborn girl, was slipping past his defenses with every day she came back. She brought him lunch once. Nothing extravagant, just pasta in a plastic container, warm and imperfect. He ate every bite. "You're the first person who's fed me without expecting something in return," he said quietly when she wasn't looking. She smiled faintly. "Then you're welcome." Moments like that scared him more than boardrooms ever could. Sophia felt it too, though she would never admit it out loud. The air between them seemed to shift whenever their eyes met, whenever their hands brushed, as she passed him a sketch, or he handed her a pen. It wasn't lust, not exactly, and not innocence either. It was something in between, a tension that hummed like an electric wire. The first time it cracked open was at the gala. He hadn't asked so much as instructed her to come. "There's a charity event in Chicago. Be there." She had stared at him, incredulous. "Timothy, I can't just—" "You can," he said with the certainty of a man who was never refused. So she went. She borrowed a dress from a classmate, simple black satin that clung where she wished it didn't. She tied her hair back to hide the nervous shaking of her hands, dabbed the faintest gloss on her lips, and told herself she was there to observe nothing more. But when she stepped into the grand lobby of the Chicago Hilton, surrounded by chandeliers and champagne flutes and gowns worth more than her tuition, she felt every pair of eyes on her. And then she saw him. Timothy froze. He had seen women in gowns finer than this, women who dripped in diamonds, and power women who had chased him across continents. But something about Sophia standing there with nothing but quiet defiance and a dress borrowed from someone else knocked the breath from his chest. "You clean up well," he murmured when she reached him. She rolled her eyes, though a blush warmed her cheeks. "Don't get used to it." The evening passed in fragments. Timothy worked the room with practiced ease, shaking hands, exchanging words that meant nothing, but moved everything. Sophia stood at his side like a shadow, invisible to some, scrutinized by others. She hated the way they looked at her, curious, dismissive, like she was a puzzle they had no interest in solving. So she slipped away to the balcony. The night air was cool, a welcome relief from the stifling ballroom. The Chicago skyline glittered across the lake, 1,000 windows reflecting in the dark water. Sophia leaned against the railing, drawing in a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You look uncomfortable." Timothy's voice came from behind her. She turned. He had followed, of course. "I'm not used to pretending," she said softly. "Neither am I." He stepped closer, his presence commanding, but not suffocating. "Then why do you do it?" she asked. For once, he didn't answer quickly. His gaze drifted across the city, his jaw tight. "Because pretending is easier than being seen." Her chest tightened. "I see you," she said quietly. His head snapped toward her. For a moment, something raw flickered across his face, something unguarded, something dangerous. He reached out, then not to possess, not to claim, but to hold her hand. It was simple, almost fragile, but the electricity of it surged through her like a storm. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. When they returned to the ballroom, everything had changed. The days that followed were dreamlike, though neither would dare call them that. Mornings still began with coffee in his office. Afternoons still bent to his schedule, but something unspoken threaded through it all. He looked at her differently now, like he was memorizing her face, the curve of her laugh, the way her eyes softened when she spoke. She in turn carried herself differently, as though the simple act of being seen had steadied something inside her. They still didn't touch, not beyond that night on the balcony. But the absence of touch was its own kind of intimacy, charged and constant. And yet both of them knew the silence wouldn't last forever. The world was watching, waiting. Sophia felt it every time she stepped outside Carter Tower. The stares, the whispers, the questions she didn't want to answer. Timothy felt it in boardrooms. The sharp glances from executives, the unspoken doubts in investors' eyes. The gravity between them was undeniable. But gravity, Sophia thought, was as dangerous as it was inevitable. And neither of them had any idea just how far they were about to fall. Sophia had never thought of silence as dangerous until it followed her like a shadow. At first, she told herself it was her imagination, the lingering stares when she left Carter Tower, the way people in the cafe on Lexington Avenue seemed to whisper when she passed. But then came the first photograph, a grainy image on a gossip blog, buried between articles about movie stars and political scandals, a young woman with braids stepping into the back of a black car. The headline was simple, almost careless. Unidentified woman spotted with Timothy Carter outside Carter Tower. Sophia's chest tightened when she saw it. She hadn't even known someone was watching. When she told Timothy, he barely looked up from the paper on his desk. "It will fade," he said, his voice smooth and dismissive, as though rumors were a currency he had long stopped counting. "They chase anything new. Tomorrow it will be someone else." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this world he lived in, the one made of headlines and secrets, traded like stocks, would pass her by if she simply kept her head down. But Sophia had never been invisible in such a cruel way. The second photo arrived a week later, clearer this time. She was leaving his office, her expression tired, her hair loose around her shoulders. The caption read, "The mystery woman returns. Who is she?" Sophia closed her laptop with shaking hands. Her instinct was to run, to retreat back to Brooklyn, to the narrow apartment with paint peeling from the walls, to the safety of obscurity. But when she tried to tell Timothy she needed space, he only leaned back in his chair, his gaze unreadable. "They'll keep digging if you leave," he said quietly. "Disappearing makes you pray. Staying makes you real." "And what if I don't want to be real?" she whispered. His eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "You already are." She didn't know what frightened her more, that he was right or that he believed it. The gala in Chicago had been the beginning, she realized. It wasn't just the photographs, the murmurs. It was the way people had looked at them together, as though she had trespassed into a world not meant for her, as though she was a placeholder until someone appropriate came along. And yet, despite the whispers, despite her fear, she kept coming back. Every morning at 10, the elevator carried her to the top of Carter Tower. And every morning, Timothy was waiting. Sometimes with coffee already poured, sometimes with silence that seemed to stretch like glass between them, sometimes with questions she didn't want to answer. But it was never indifference. Never that. One morning, as she set her sketchbook on the desk, Timothy asked, "Do you regret it?" Regret what? She said cautiously. That night, the dare. Crawling into the wrong bed, her breath caught. She hadn't thought about it in those words before. "I regret why I did it," she admitted. "I don't regret what came after." He studied her as if committing the words to memory. "Neither do I." It was the closest thing to an admission he had given her, and for a fleeting moment, it was enough. The moment shattered a few days later. Sophia had gone to campus for a critique session. Her professors, usually reserved, but fair, had seemed distracted. They glanced at her work without focus, their comments clipped and perfunctory. When she left the classroom, 2 classmates were huddled near the door, their voices hushed, but not hushed enough. "She's the girl from the blog, isn't she? Imagine sleeping your way out of student loans." Sophia froze. The words lodged in her chest like shards of glass. By the time she made it back to her apartment, her hands were trembling so badly she could barely fit the key into the lock. She didn't cry, she was too exhausted for tears, but something inside her began to hollow out. That night, she didn't go to Carter Tower. She stayed in bed, the walls pressing in on her, her phone buzzing with messages she didn't want to read. At 11:00 p.m., there was a knock at her door. Her roommates had already gone out the apartment silent, except for the pounding in her chest. She opened it hesitantly, and there he was, Timothy Carter, standing in the dimly lit hallway of her crumbling Brooklyn building. No driver, no security, no armor of a tailored suit. Just him. "I thought you weren't coming back," he said softly. "I wasn't," she admitted. "Why?" "Because they know," she whispered. "Everyone knows." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The space felt smaller with him in it, his presence filling every corner. He didn't touch her, didn't reach for her, but his voice was steady. "Then let them." Her laugh was sharp, brittle. "You don't understand. I'm not built for this. I'm not built to be a headline." "You're not a headline," he said. "You're the first person who's looked at me without calculation in years. You matter more than their whispers." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to sink into those words like a lifeline. But she was too tired, too raw. She turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. "Sometimes," she said softly, "love isn't enough." He stilled. "Is that what this is?" Her breath caught, but she didn't answer. The silence between them was louder than any confession. The next morning, she found herself in his office again. Not because she was ready, not because the whispers had quieted, but because something in her couldn't stay away. She sat across from him, her notebook open, but untouched. He didn't push. He didn't question. He simply worked beside her, the unspoken weight of the night before hanging between them. When she finally stood to leave, he said, "Sophia." She turned. "You don't have to be unshakable. That's my job." For the first time since the photos appeared, she let herself breathe. But the world did not relent. The following week, a glossy magazine ran a piece with a headline she couldn't ignore: "The Girl Who Cracked Carter." The article was filled with speculation, half-truths, anonymous sources claiming she was a distraction, a liability. They had found her social media, her old sketches, even her family history. Every detail of her life dissected and displayed. Sophia read it once, twice, then closed her laptop with a calmness that frightened her. That night, she sat across from Timothy, in the dim light of his penthouse, the city sprawling endlessly beyond the glass. He was pacing his phone, buzzing with calls. He ignored, his jaw tight with fury. "I'll bury them," he said coldly. "Every last one of them. Timothy, I'll sue. I'll destroy their advertisers. I'll make sure they never print another word." "Stop," she whispered. He froze, turning to her. "I don't want to be the reason you burn everything down," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to be your war." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hands gripping the edge of the couch where she sat. His eyes were fire, his voice rough. "You're not my war," he said. "You're the only reason I'm still fighting." Her breath hitched. It was the kind of truth that didn't need proof, the kind that terrified her, because it was real. And as he leaned back, his gaze softening, Sophia realized that whatever came next, whatever storm was waiting, neither of them could pretend anymore. This wasn't just a dare gone wrong. It was a story that could consume them both. The storm did not arrive all at once. It built slowly, quietly, like pressure beneath glass, until one day, the first crack appeared. Sophia had thought the whispers in her classroom were cruel, but they were nothing compared to what came next. The blogs had teeth now. Anonymous posts turned into full articles. Her name wasn't printed, not at first, but her face was. Photographs of her leaving Carter Tower, stepping into Timothy's car once, even laughing with him in the lobby. She hadn't realized anyone was watching, hadn't felt the camera flashing. But the evidence was there in glossy color, for strangers to dissect. The Girl in Carter's Shadow. From Dare to Billionaire's Bed, Who is she? Headlines written like knives. The first time Sophia saw herself online, she nearly dropped her phone. The image was small, low resolution, but there was no mistaking it was her. Her braid slipping loose over her shoulder, her eyes downcast, her entire body speaking of someone caught between fleeing and staying. Her hands trembled so badly, she closed the browser, but it didn't matter. Once seen, it couldn't be unseen. By the time she walked into Carter Tower that morning, her chest was tight with panic. She wanted to hide to erase herself from the world's gaze. But Timothy was waiting calm as ever, in a suit the color of midnight. "They're writing about me," she blurted, her voice sharper than she intended. "They write about everyone," he replied. "Not like this." He looked at her then, and for the first time she saw something that unnerved her, more than his control resignation. As though he had expected this all along. "They'll spin stories," he said. "They'll call you names. They'll dig until they think they've found something that explains why He stopped himself, his jaw tightening. "Why you're here. And what will they find?" she whispered. His gaze softened, just slightly. "That you don't want anything from me, which is why they'll never understand." The words should have comforted her, but instead they left her hollow. Because she understood something else. Truth didn't matter. Not to people hungry for spectacle. The escalation came 2 days later. A photograph crystal clear, plastered across the homepage of a gossip site, Timothy Carter at a charity gala, Sophia at his side. Her black satin dress borrowed, her lips glossed her eyes, uncertain, but luminous, under the chandeliers. The caption beneath read, "Carter's secret has the untouchable billionaire finally fallen within hours." The photograph was everywhere. Screens lit up with it in coffee shops, offices, subway stations. Students at Sophia's design program passed it, from phone to phone. Her professors avoided her eyes. Even strangers on the street seemed to pause, recognizing her face from somewhere they couldn't quite place. She stopped going to class, stopped sketching, stopped answering calls from Jasmine, who left frantic voicemails urging her not to let the city devour her. Instead, Sophia stayed in her apartment curtains, drawn the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the dark. Her laptop glowed with words she shouldn't read, but couldn't look away from. Gold digger, climber, distraction. The accusations were endless, none of them true, all of them cutting. When Timothy came to see her, she refused at first to open the door, but his voice, steady and unyielding, broke through. "Sophia, don't let them decide who you are." She pulled the door open, then her eyes red-rimmed, her braid undone. "They already have." He stepped inside, closing the door with quiet finality. In the dim light of her apartment, stripped of his suit jacket and armor, he looked almost human, almost breakable. "I'll fix it," he said. "You can't." His jaw tightened. "I can bury them, buy them, sue them until they bleed. I can make them regret ever printing your name." Her laugh was sharp, desperate. "And what then? They'll just call me something else. A scandal, a liability. The woman who cost Timothy Carter his empire." He reached for her, then his hand hovering just shy of touching her cheek. "You're not a liability." "Then what am I?" she whispered. His eyes softened, raw and unguarded. "You're the only person who makes me feel alive." The words nearly broke her, because part of her wanted to believe, wanted to surrender to that fragile truth. But another part, the part forged by years of scraping by, of being overlooked, of knowing what it meant to be disposable, feared what would happen when the world decided they were wrong. The board of Carter Systems met that week. Sophia wasn't there, but she heard about it afterward in fragments pieced together from Timothy's clipped tone and the exhaustion in his eyes. Investors were raising questions. Executives whispered about distractions, about control slipping through his fingers. One man had asked outright if Timothy had gone soft. Sophia imagined the silence that followed the weight of his stare silencing the room. But silence didn't erase suspicion. It lingered, growing like mold. That night she found him on the balcony of his penthouse, his shoulders rigid, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. The city glittered below, indifferent, relentless. "You're losing everything you built," she said softly, her arms wrapped around herself. "It's just money." "No, it's your life." He turned, then his gaze cutting. "You're the only part of my life that makes sense." Her chest tightened. The city lights blurred as tears stung her eyes. "Then why does it feel like we're holding our breath?" He didn't answer, and that silence was enough. Sophia made her decision the next morning. While he slept, she packed a small bag, just the essentials. A few changes of clothes, her sketchbook, the necklace he had once slipped into her hand, a silver star she hadn't taken off until now. She placed it carefully on the kitchen counter with a note, written in trembling script. "I'm so sorry." When Timothy woke, to find it something inside him cracked. Not the part that calculated profit margins or anticipated market trends, but the part he had buried under layers of control. The part that had once believed love was too dangerous to survive. He didn't call his lawyers. He didn't call his driver. He drove himself across the city, searching the places she had once mentioned, in passing the bookstore in Brooklyn, where she liked to sit by the window, the cafe that served her favorite tea, the art supply store she couldn't afford, but wandered through anyway. She wasn't in any of them. By nightfall, the penthouse felt hollow without her, the bed untouched, the silence deafening. Timothy carried her sketch with him instead, a drawing she had left on his desk, a portrait of him standing by the window, loneliness etched into ink. He folded it into his briefcase, worn from the weight of his touch. He told himself she would return, that she couldn't vanish so easily. But as the days passed and the headlines continued, the hope that had sustained him began to thin. And in the quiet, he wondered if this was what it meant to finally lose not a deal, not a company, but the one thing he had never allowed himself to believe in. Sophia sat on the porch of her aunt's house in Maine, the Atlantic stretching endless and gray beyond the horizon. The salt air stung her lungs, the wind tugged at her braids, and for the first time in weeks, no one knew her name. She told herself this was what safety felt like, but when she looked down at her phone screen, dark, waiting for a message that never came, her chest ached with something dangerously close to regret. Timothy Carter stood alone in his office, Manhattan, glittering beyond the glass, and for the first time in his life, the city felt empty. He had built an empire. He had survived scandal and loss. He had faced boardrooms of men waiting for him to break. But nothing had prepared him for the silence she left behind. And nothing, not power, not wealth, not control, could fix it. Not unless he found her. Not unless she let him. The city felt smaller without her. Timothy Carter had always thought of Manhattan as endless, an empire of steel and light that bent to his will. But now, walking its streets without Sophia, it felt stripped bare, as though the skyline itself had hollowed. Every tower was glass, every window a mirror, reflecting the absence he carried, like a shadow. Days passed in fragments. Meetings blurred into noise, investors droned about numbers that once ignited him, but now rang hollow. At night, the penthouse remained untouched, its silence oppressive. He had not returned to that bed since the morning she left, as though it too had turned into a shrine he could not desecrate. He searched for her, though he didn't admit it out loud. Discreet inquiries through channels that never failed him before. But Sophia was clever, and distance was her ally. It was a package that finally broke through. Arriving without return address, tucked into the morning's deliveries, it was simple. A small box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was the silver star necklace he had once given her. Beneath it, a note written in her slanted hand. "This belonged to you before me. It shouldn't remind you of pain." He closed the box slowly, his hands steady though the ground beneath him tilted. For the first time in his life, Timothy canceled everything. His assistant had stared when he said the words disbelieving. Indefinitely, he added his tone, leaving no space for negotiation. He was done with boardrooms, done with pretending he didn't bleed. Sophia had not expected him to find her. The little house in Maine belonged to her aunt, a weathered structure with white paint peeling from the porch railings, perched above the sea. The ocean was constant gray, restless, its roar filling the silence she carried inside. She filled her days with small tasks, cooking, sweeping, sketching in the margins of her notebook, though most pages remained unfinished. It was easier to pretend here, easier to imagine she had slipped out of one life and into another, far from cameras, far from the sharp edge of voices that reduced her to a scandal. But at night, when the wind rattled the shutters and the sea clawed at the shore, her thoughts betrayed her. She thought of his voice low and steady, saying she mattered. She thought of the way his hand had trembled against hers, a man made of stone undone by touch. And no matter how many times she told herself it was safer this way, her phone remained by her bed screen, dark, waiting. When the black car pulled into the gravel drive one late afternoon, she froze. The ocean roared behind her, gulls crying in the distance, but all she heard was her pulse. The door opened, and he stepped out. No suit, no tie, no armor. Just Timothy's shoulders, squared eyes, shadowed with exhaustion, the wind tugging at his shirt. He looked less like the untouchable billionaire splashed across magazines, and more like the man who had once whispered confessions in the dark of his office. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You left your birthday marked on my calendar," he said simply, "and if you didn't want me to find you, you wouldn't have done that." Tears stung her eyes before she could stop them. "You gave everything up." Not everything, he said, stepping closer. Just the things that never mattered. She rose from the porch steps slowly, her heart in her throat. "Why are you here?" "Because I loved you the moment you were lying in my bed without knowing who I was," he said. His voice cracked then for the first time she had ever heard. "And I love you more now that you've walked away knowing exactly who I am." Her knees nearly buckled. "I was never supposed to matter this much." "You were never supposed to be a dare," he replied, "but you became my truth." The wind whipped her hair. Her hands trembled at her sides. For so long she had believed leaving was the only way to save them both. But now, looking at him, she wondered if running had only left them bleeding in silence. "What now?" she whispered. He reached for her hand, his grip firm, steady, anchoring. "Now I stop pretending I know how to do this perfectly, and I start showing up anyway." She stepped into his arms, then her cheek against his chest, his heartbeat thunderous beneath her ear. He held her, as though he had been waiting his entire life for this moment, as though letting go was no longer an option. And for the first time since the storm began, Sophia believed him. They did not return to Manhattan immediately. Timothy stayed in Maine with her for a week, ignoring calls, ignoring the empire he had once built his life around. The sea became their witness, the salt air sharp against their skin, as they walked the shore in silence, their shadows long in the fading light. At night, they sat on the porch with mugs of coffee gone cold, speaking in fragments. She told him about Atlanta, about her mother's endless shifts at the diner, about the nights she studied by candlelight when the power bill went unpaid. He told her about Boston, about the last argument with his fiancée before the accident, about the guilt that had haunted him like a chain. Neither spoke to fix the other. They spoke to be heard. And somewhere in those quiet nights, Sophia began to understand that maybe safety wasn't in running away, but in being seen and staying anyway. Timothy in turn realized that strength wasn't in control, but in surrendering it to someone who refused to take advantage. On the 8th day, he told her the truth. "I can't stay here forever," he said, his hand closing over hers. "The world won't wait. My board won't wait." Sophia's chest tightened. She had known this moment would come, the real world demanding its due. "And if we go back, then we stop hiding," he said. "We stop pretending this is temporary." Her heart raced, her voice barely steady. "And if it destroys everything?" He looked at her eyes, raw voice, steady. "Then let it. What I lose doesn't matter. Who I lose does." Her breath shuddered. "You'll regret it." "I regret nothing but the years I spent alone," he said. And with that, the decision was made. When they returned to Manhattan, the city greeted them with its usual indifference. Horns, lights, headlines waiting like predators. But something had shifted. They walked side by side through the lobby of Carter Tower, not as billionaire and scandal, not as predator and prey, but as something far more dangerous. Two people who had chosen each other. Reporters shouted questions from the sidewalk. Cameras flashed, but Timothy did not flinch. He kept his hand steady at the small of her back, guiding her through the noise. Sophia lifted her chin. For the first time, she didn't look away. Inside the tower, silence closed around them, but it was no longer oppressive. It was a promise. "You're not invisible anymore," Timothy murmured. "I know," she said softly, "and I don't want to be." He smiled, then faint, but real, a man remade. And though the storm was far from over, though the world would not stop circling, Sophia knew one truth with absolute clarity. Sometimes survival wasn't in disappearing. Sometimes it was in standing at the center of the fire and refusing to burn alone. The first step into Carter Tower had felt like defiance. But defiance, Sophia quickly learned, had consequences. Reporters camped outside the glass doors day after day, their voices rising like a chorus whenever she appeared at Timothy's side. Cameras flashed mercilessly, demanding answers she had no words for. Every morning became a gauntlet, her hand brushing against Timothy's, as if that small connection was enough to steady her through the storm. The headlines only grew louder. The mystery woman no more. Sophia De Luna identified. From Brooklyn to boardrooms is she Carter's undoing Billionaire and Black Beauty, the love story Wall Street can't swallow. Some were cruel, others patronizing, all invasive. They dredged up her scholarship records, her mother's diner shifts in Atlanta, even photographs of her father leaving years ago. They called her resilient in one breath and opportunist in the next. Sophia tried to shut it out. She buried herself in sketches in long mornings, sitting across from Timothy in his office, while he worked in quiet evenings, where he poured wine, neither of them touched. But the noise seeped through. It always did. The first betrayal came from inside. One of her classmates at the Design Institute, a girl who had once shared notes and cigarettes on the dorm rooftop, sold photographs of Sophia's sketches to a blog. They were intimate drawings, moments captured of Timothy unguarded, leaning against a window, his hands buried in his pockets, loneliness etched into every line. Sophia stared at the images online, nausea rising. They had been hers, private pieces of her heart she had never meant for the world. When Timothy walked into the room, she slammed the laptop shut, but it was too late. He had seen. Who gave them these? His voice was low, sharp. She swallowed. Someone from school. It doesn't matter. It matters, he snapped. They took something from you. From us. Her eyes burned. Everything's already been taken. My name, my past, now this. What's left? For a moment he said nothing. Then he crossed the room and knelt in front of her, his hands steady as they closed over hers. You're left, he said, and that's the only part I refuse to lose. The conviction in his voice shook her, but it did not erase the hollow ache inside. Timothy faced his own fire. At the next board meeting, the pressure was suffocating. Suits lined the long mahogany table, their eyes sharp, their voices measured, but merciless. They spoke of distractions, instability, the company's reputation fraying in the press. One executive, bold enough to voice what others only implied, asked, "Is she worth the empire you're dismantling?" The silence that followed was heavy, electric. Timothy's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady when he answered. She's worth more than any empire. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet. Some looked away, others exchanged tight-lipped glances. He knew then that his control, once absolute, was slipping, but he did not flinch. When he returned to his office, Sophia was waiting, perched on the couch with her sketchbook in her lap. She looked up when he entered, her eyes soft but questioning. "They'll replace me," he said flatly. "No," she whispered. "Yes," he countered. "If they believe I've lost my edge, they'll cut me out of my own creation." She set her sketchbook aside and stood crossing the room until she was close enough to touch him. "Then let them. You're more than what you built." He searched her face, the raw sincerity in her gaze. For years, he had defined himself by walls of glass and numbers on screens, by the empire he carved from silence. And now, this woman, this girl who had once stumbled drunkenly into his bed, was the only one reminding him he was still human. But the city was merciless. Walking through Midtown, one evening hand in hand, Sophia felt the weight of every eye. A woman in pearls hissed under her breath as they passed. A man in a tailored suit muttered, "What's he thinking?" loud enough for her to hear. Even the barista at the coffee shop who once smiled at her, who averted her gaze. By the time they reached the car, Sophia's throat was tight, her hand trembling in his. "Maybe they're right," she whispered. Timothy turned sharply. "About what?" "That I don't belong in your world. That I'm the wrong story, the wrong face, the wrong—" "Stop." He cut in, his voice sharp with an edge she rarely heard. "You belong because I say you do. Because I see you when no one else ever did." Her eyes filled, but she shook her head. Sometimes being seen isn't enough. His jaw clenched, his silence louder than any argument. That night, she dreamed of leaving again, of slipping away in the dark, packing, quietly disappearing before dawn. But when she woke, his arm was draped across her waist, his breath steady against her shoulder. For the first time, she realized it wasn't only her life unraveling, it was his too, and the guilt was unbearable. She pulled away gently, slipping out of bed, pacing the length of the penthouse as the city glittered beyond the glass. She had thought walking away once was the hardest choice she would ever make, but staying watching him fight battles he might not win was worse. When Timothy stirred awake, he found her by the window, arms wrapped tight around herself. "You're thinking of running again," he said quietly. Her breath caught. "I don't want to be the reason you lose everything." He rose, crossing the room until he stood behind her, his reflection towering beside hers in the glass. Then be the reason I finally live for something that isn't numbers and power. Her voice cracked. And if living with me costs you everything, then it costs me everything, he said, steady and sure. And I'll still count it as gain. She turned then, tears streaking her cheeks, and for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe love was not about safety. Maybe it was about choosing the fire, even when it burned. But the fire was only beginning. 2 weeks later, a major financial paper ran a headline that made her stomach twist. Carter's empire, at-risk investors question, leadership amid scandal. The article was brutal. It claimed Timothy's relationship had weakened his grip, that his judgment was compromised. Anonymous sources whispered he had missed calls, delayed deals, canceled trips. And in the center of it all was her photograph, printed in black and white, her eyes wide and uncertain, captioned only with her name. Sophia read it once, twice, her hands trembling. She wanted to be angry, to scream, but all she felt was crushing guilt. When Timothy entered the room, she held up the paper. They're destroying you because of me. No, he said evenly. They're destroying me because I finally showed I'm human, and they don't know how to tolerate that. Her tears fell freely now. I can't watch this. I can't watch you fall apart because of me. He crossed the room and took her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her tears away. His voice was low, fierce, unyielding. Listen to me, Sophia De Luna. You were never the cause. You're the cure. If I lose them, if I lose everything, I'll still have what matters, and that's you. She shook her head, sobs breaking through. I don't know how to be enough for you. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm and ragged. You already are. And in that moment, amidst the firestorm, amidst the headlines and betrayals and doubts, Sophia realized the truth she had been running from since the night of the dare. Sometimes belonging wasn't about fitting into a world that hated you. Sometimes it was about standing beside someone who refused to let you disappear, even if it meant burning everything else down. The breaking point came, not with a photograph, not with a whisper, but with a headline too sharp to ignore. From dare to disaster. How Sophia De Luna nearly ruined Timothy Carter. It was printed in bold on the front page of a national paper, the kind that found its way into boardrooms, airports, kitchen counters. Inside were paragraphs dissecting her life with surgical cruelty, her student loans, her part-time jobs, the diner where her mother still worked, double shifts. They called her a distraction, a liability, a girl who had climbed into the wrong bed and dragged the city's most untouchable man down with her. And at the center was a photograph she had never seen, taken her standing barefoot on Timothy's balcony at dawn, wrapped in one of his shirts, staring out at the skyline. Sophia couldn't breathe when she saw it. She closed the paper with shaking hands and sat on the couch, knees pulled tight to her chest, the walls of the penthouse pressing in. Don't read it, Timothy said when he found her. It's everywhere, she whispered. It's me. I never asked for this, Timothy. I never asked to be your scandal. You're not a scandal, he said firmly, though the exhaustion in his voice betrayed the battles he was fighting behind closed doors. Her tears burned. Then what am I? Because the world seems very sure of the answer. He sat beside her, his hand closing over hers. You're the only thing in my life that's real. But reality, Sophia knew, came with consequences. The pressure tightened like a noose. Investors threatened to pull out. Executives whispered in corridors. One evening, Timothy came home later than usual, his face drawn, his tie loose. He poured himself a drink and downed it in one swallow before she could ask. "They want me gone," he said flatly. "The board is drafting a vote to push me out." Sophia's breath caught. "Because of me. Because I'm not the machine they built anymore," he corrected, though his eyes were heavy. "Because I let them see I could care about something." She reached for his hand, but he pulled it away, not in rejection, but in frustration, his fingers raking through his hair. "I could fight it. I could bury them in lawsuits, in leverage, in every tool I've ever used. But I don't want to fight anymore, Sophia. I'm so damn tired of fighting." Her heart ached at the rawness in his voice, the man beneath the empire laid bare. She had thought loving him meant stepping into his fortress, but maybe it meant standing beside him as it crumbled. "Then stop," she whispered. He looked at her, startled. "Let them take it," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "Let them have the company, the headlines, all of it. If it costs you this much, it was never yours to keep." His chest rose and fell, his silence loud with disbelief. No one had ever told him to surrender. No one had ever dared. But she had. The next morning, the city woke to another storm. News broke that Timothy Carter had resigned as CEO of Carter Systems. Analysts speculated, headlines screamed, investors panicked. Some called it madness, others brilliance. But for Timothy, it was neither. It was freedom. He held the press conference in the same building where he had built his empire, his voice calm, unwavering. He did not mention Sophia's name, but when the questions came, was it true? Had he been compromised? He answered with quiet steel. "The truth is simple," he said. "I no longer care to live a life measured only in profit and control. For years I thought that was enough. I was wrong." Sophia watched from the side, hidden from the cameras, her throat tight. He wasn't just speaking to them. He was speaking to her. When it ended, he found her in the quiet of a back room. His tie loosened, his face pale with exhaustion, but his eyes alight with something she hadn't seen before. "Peace. It's done," he said. Her voice broke. "You gave up everything." "No," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I kept what mattered, and for the first time since the night of the dare." Sophia let herself believe that maybe love wasn't about survival, but about surrendering to the one person who saw you when no one else did. The weeks that followed were strange, suspended between endings and beginnings. The media storm burned hot, then cooled as storms always did. New scandals rose. New names replaced theirs. Timothy disappeared from headlines. Sophia's face faded from gossip sites, and the world moved on. But they didn't. In the quiet that followed, they built something small. Sophia returned to her design program, not as the scandal everyone whispered about, but as herself. Some professors still eyed her with suspicion, some classmates with envy, but she no longer flinched. She sketched with a new steadiness, her lines bolder, her visions sharper. She was no longer invisible, not to herself, not to the man waiting for her at home. Timothy, for the first time in years, woke without schedules carved into his bones. He traveled with her to Maine, sat on her aunt's porch, drinking coffee as the sea roared. He walked the streets of Brooklyn unnoticed, anonymous free. He no longer carried the weight of a world demanding perfection. At night, they lay side by side in a bed that was theirs, not a shrine, not a symbol. Just a place where two people once strangers now belonged. On the 6-month anniversary of the night, Sophia had lost that dare. Timothy returned with her to the Waldorf Astoria. The elevator hummed as it rose, the numbers glowing one by one until they reached the top. The hallway stretched long and silent velvet and gold, just as it had been that night. When they stepped into the penthouse, the room was no longer intimidating. The city still glittered beyond the windows, but it no longer felt like a threat. On the bed lay an envelope. Sophia picked it up with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, his handwriting bold and steady. "I never believed in accidents until you." She turned to him, her eyes shining. This is where it started. He stepped closer, his hand warm against hers. "No," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "This is where I began." They lay there side by side, the city humming beyond the glass, no longer enemies of the world, but simply two people who had chosen each other against every odd. And in that moment, Sophia understood the truth she had feared for so long. Sometimes the wrong bed could lead you to the right person. And sometimes love did not arrive dressed as destiny, but as chaos, raw, uninvited, unstoppable. It was not the fairy tale she had once sketched in the corners of her notebooks. It was harder, messier, scarier. But it was theirs, and that made it worth keeping.